I'm Duncan McRae. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Ancient Greek and Roman Studies and participating faculty member in the graduate group in Ancient History and Mediterranean Archaeology. It's my pleasure to introduce today's Sather professor. Normally, it's this year's Sather professor, but it's today's Sather professor, who is Greg Woolf, Leon Levy director and professor of Ancient Mediterranean Studies at the Institute for the Study of Ancient World at NYU. Greg has just arrived in New York. Until December, he was the Ronald J. Mellor Distinguished Professor of Ancient History at UCLA, and he had previously been the director of the Institute of Classical Studies in London and a professor of ancient history at the University of St. Andrews. In fall 2022, he was the Sather Professor of Classical Literature here at Berkeley. Greg Woolf's status as a leading Roman historian, or the leading Roman historian, rests on his profound interventions on a whole series of fundamental topics: the patterns of Roman imperialism and provincial cultures, the history of knowledge under the empire, the history of ancient religion, and the connected stories of ancient urbanism and environment. He is the author of 6 books and responsible for 10 edited volumes. He's also done, and continues to do, vital work to communicate our current understanding of Roman culture to broad audiences, in books aimed at a variety of audiences, and as a frequent guest on the popular BBC radio show and podcast In Our Time. To reintroduce him to our community for this exceptional return Sather lecture, I thought it would be a good idea to see what he has published since 2022. Quite honestly, I thought this gimmick was going to be efficient. I thought maybe I would read a couple of essays. That is not the case. What has Greg Woolf been up to lately? What have you done for us lately, Greg? So, given the pace of academic publication for most scholars, even leaders of the field, 2 calendar years would be time, I think, to publish a couple of articles. If the timing is right, a book, not Greg Woolf. He has published 6 substantial articles, and in addition is responsible for 2 new volumes of scholarly essays, and for which he wrote the co-introductions of each. Co-wrote the introductions for each. Much more impressive still than the quantity is the range and innovative quality of these essays. It's really, the scope here is amazing. He's written on the Roman Mediterranean as a fluid system. Not that fluid, it turns out. Really. On ritual middle grounds of empire in New Spain, that is colonial Mexico and ancient Rome. On the embedded economics of Roman traditional religion. Polytheism really makes a big difference and massive change with Christianity. On small cities in the Roman provinces. On the contemporary state of the field in Roman imperial archaeology, and a synthesis of his evolutionary perspective on pre-modern urbanism. The edited volumes focus on ancient religious sanctuaries and experience. I couldn't get hold of that one, Greg, I'm sorry. Our library doesn't have it yet. And a really fascinating and important volume, I think, on gendering Roman imperialism, pointing out, in fact, that the Roman Empire, unlike many, many other empires, has really not been considered in terms of its gender history sufficiently or even at all. Roman history, global history, Roman archaeology, world archaeology, economic history, religious history, political history, gender history. That's just 23 and 24. Amazing. In his first Sather lecture in 2022, Professor Woolf introduced us to a Roman Empire on a tilted planet. He sketched the possibility of a seasonal analysis of ancient landscapes, not just the beats of the solar cycle, but the coordinated cadences of human life. In particular, in that first lecture, he focused on the seasonal patterns of the Roman emperors themselves, and made the fascinating and still revelatory argument to me that during the winter, there may simply have been less of a Roman Empire. It's a pleasure then to welcome Professor Greg Woolf back to Berkeley, and I can't wait to hear him again on the topic of emperors in his lecture, A Distant Tyrant, Emperor, Empire, Impotence. Thank you, Greg.
Well, thank you for those very kind words, Duncan. I am a terrible magpie, it's true. It's lovely to be back. I had an absolutely fantastic semester here as Sather Professor, and it's lovely to see everybody again. My subject is is the Roman emperor. Galen tells a particularly horrible story about the Emperor Hadrian. The Emperor Hadrian, they say, struck one of his slaves in the eye with a stylus. And when he learned the man had lost his eye because of the wound, he summoned the slave and allowed him to ask for a gift equal to his pain and loss. When the slave who'd suffered the loss remained silent, Hadrian again asked him to speak up and ask whatever he might wish. But he asked for nothing but another eye, for what gift could match in value the eye which had been destroyed? Now, Galen is writing about the mastery of one's passions, that one should master your passions. And violence against the enslaved is, for Galen, a good test case because the enslaved could not retaliate. They were, in theory, liable to almost any level of violence. Galen himself had made it a rule never to strike a slave. His father, he says, had done the same, but Galen had witnessed somebody else do what he describes Hadrian doing in this anecdote. And it's a grim thought that Galen almost certainly dictated these words that we're reading here to an enslaved amanuensis, taking down dictation with an exactly similar stylus. I'm beginning with this story because it illustrates the theme of today's Sather lecture, the impotence of Roman emperors. Hadrian had the same power as any other free man over the enslaved, but he was crucially unable to grant the wounded man's request. Even a living God had limits on his power. Galen couldn't give the slave his eye back. Now, the limits of the Roman emperor's power have been a central theme in studies of the political system of the Roman world since the publication in 1977 of the late Sir Fergus Miller's book, The Emperor in the Roman World. And I'm going to refer to this as emperor as we go along because it's going to haunt my lecture in a way. That book transformed the field. It generated some very critical responses, but it also shaped a new generation of scholarship. And if you've got access to the handout, you'll see I've called it Resetting the Roman Empire, Roman Emperor, or Rebooting the Roman Emperor. Miller's central thesis, supported by a vast mass of testimony, combined anecdotes like this one, with fragments from epigraphy, from papyrology, from jurisprudential material. And his thesis at its heart was simple. Emperors did not animate or drive the imperial machine. They were almost entirely reactive. Their power was exercised mostly through their responses to requests from other people. Queries from governors, from cities, from subjects. And this characteristic gesture of an emperor receiving letters or verbal petitions or listening to speeches in Greek, as he puts on point, has been dubbed a model called petition and response. The subject petitions and the emperor responds, sometimes simply by writing the word subscripti underneath the request. A governor requests architects, a city asks for tax relief, an enslaved man asks for a new eyeball. On each occasion, the emperor says yes or no, or presumably very occasionally, this even I cannot do. Now, Fergus Miller delivered the Sather lectures in 2002 to 3. In retirement, he wrote about 25 articles and several new books. He died in 2019 in a biographical memoir written for the British Academy's necrologies. Alan Bowman and Martin Goodman discussed the book and its reception. And they wrote this: Miller himself was clear in his belief that for the historian, true originality consisted not in striving to find brilliant new solutions for old problems, but in having a point of view and being led by the evidence in developing it. And this is a very close paraphrase of something Fergus himself used to say to his students: form a view and then pursue it hard, which is exactly the opposite advice that I give to any of my students. That assessment of Miller is spot on. Miller's view was not a hypothesis, and the evidence he gathered wasn't used to test it. Instead, it was used to develop it. Often at great length, The Emperor in the Roman World weighs in at 600 pages, exclude the appendices. It is not his biggest book. He refused to write an index, believing people should read the entire thing for themselves. And that's why it's not published by Oxford University Press, but by Duckworth. Critics still felt he was too selective. What about other topics? What about taxation? What about military campaigns? What about diplomacy? What about frontiers? What about the work of legislation? What about bureaucrats? Did the emperors never take the initiative? Were they always on the back foot? Were they always passive? And there were other critiques that probed more deeply. What about the ideological institutional structures that shape petitions, or even discouraged them from being made in the first place? Were there areas of the emperor's activity that never found its way onto bronze, marble, or papyrus? Keith Hopkins immediately thought of lovemaking and hunting. Does the fact that the surviving testimony record communications between the emperor and his Greek subjects reflect an actual bias in his activity, as Miller seems to have thought, or is it just an unevenness in the evidence? And even if we accept his dictum that the emperor was what the emperor did, how much of what he did was in this analysis? And if some emperors, like Antoninus Pius, seem to have rested like benevolent spiders at the centre of a web that stretched across the empire, what about those energetic emperors like Hadrian, who travelled restlessly around their positions? Was this frantic activity really passive? So it's difficult to reconcile Miller's implicit claim that the emperors were much the same all the way from Pompey to Constantine — he later extended it in the Lectures a couple of centuries — with ancient narratives that reflect an obsession with the character of individual emperors. When authors compile gruesome anecdotes like the one I began with and tell of endless attempts and plotted assassination attempts, can it really be the case that the Roman emperor's activity didn't matter? Why try and murder an emperor if they're all the same? As Frick Meyer put it in his best-selling popular book, Emperors Do Not Die in Bed. Now, there's some general answers, of course, about how to reconcile institutional history and the history of events, or how to reconcile Weberian idealtypen with actual instances. And we now have a bunch of other wonderful studies of the Roman emperor, which have nuanced and added to Miller's picture. And I put just a few up on the picture here, although it's highly selective, and the bibliography's got a few others as well. Olivia Hexter, in particular, in a recent long dialogue with his former Dr. Vater, Miller, works around this, trying to find other ways that this can be done. Caius Tuori talks about the slow coagulation of institutions around the person of the emperor, and repeated attempts by individual emperors to go beyond the custom. Norbert Elias's study of how absolutist monarchs struggled to retain control of the ceremonial of court has been skillfully applied to Roman emperors by Catherine Edwards. And we can also see much more clearly now how conventions of rulership were elaborated by courtiers and philosophers in works like Seneca's On Clemency and in endless oratorical performances. And it's conventional to start this with Cicero's Pro Marcello, and also to note that Menander Rater, who gives Guide to Rhetoric, restricts himself almost entirely to speeches of praise. Even the circulation of anecdotes like the one about Hadrian and the slave formed part of a currency that prescribed some imperial behaviours and promoted others. Intellectuals worked hard, as Matt Roller put it, to construct autocracy, to elaborate norms for a good emperor and a tyrant, norms against which new emperors knew that they would be judged. But today I want to take a different tack, because I think in one important respect Miller was absolutely right. The fundamental weakness of the emperors derived from the vastness of the spaces they claimed to control. In Miller's own words, the distance in space and time, which inevitably separated the emperor from the overwhelming majority of his subjects, is one of the fundamental categories within which the nature of government in the Roman Empire has to be assessed. And I think he's absolutely right about this. My lecture today makes two claims. The first one, which I expect to be greeted as completely unexceptionable, is to endorse and elaborate Miller's view about distances. The geographical scale of Roman power, combined with the feebleness of ancient communication technologies, made active rule of the entire empire impossible at any given moment. The empire then, I suggest, was an unsteerable juggernaut, one that couldn't be directed either from the centre or by most dynamic emperors like from the edge. So emperors might rush like captains manically around the deck of the empire, but the juggernaut still goes on. Emperors might be locally autocratic, but had huge difficulties extending either their benevolence or their tyranny for any distance. But my second claim, I think, is more controversial. That's that the aftermath of the emperor in the Roman world, historians of the Roman Empire have devoted great energy and ingenuity to asking how the empire nevertheless functioned, when perhaps what we should have been asking is whether it functioned at all. So now I come to the second part of the talk, and there are 5 parts. It's on the handout. Now, one of the strongest arguments against the notion that emperor is the animating force at the heart of empire does not in fact depend on amassed ancient testimony, but on the slowness of Roman communications. Now, it's true of all empires, of course, before the invention of the telegraph in the middle of the 19th century, that no message can move faster than a human being. It's been calculated that even in the summer, it might take 30 days for a messenger from Londinium to reach Rome, or even Alexandria and Rome, the two greatest cities in the empire, which might be connected entirely by sea voyages, were never closer than 20 days apart. So this is a production of the Stanford Orbis project, which Walter Scheidel and his collaborators put together. Now, Richard Duncan-Jones used more traditional measures, scrutinising papyri from Egypt, to see how long it took a provincial population to work out that the emperor had changed. Actual distances in time varied enormously, but the mean time depth between the death of an emperor and someone in Egypt realising it happened was over 60 days. Some of them seem to have subsisted for nearly a year, unaware that they need to change their dating formula. It's like the way I write checks, I think. These figures endorse Miller's insistence on the difficulties of communications, not just between subject and ruler, but also between emperor and his various agents in the provinces, the army commanders, the governors, the officials who oversaw taxation and the collection of revenues of imperial properties, the thousands of enslaved and formerly enslaved members of the Familia Caesaris who undertook not only the more menial, but also the more confidential work of empire. In my forthcoming Say the Book, I explore the seasonal rhythms of communication, as Duncan made clear. Journeys across land became even longer in the winter, journeys by sea became riskier, armies and emperors dug in, so that in effect the empire expanded and entered an annual sluggishness akin to hibernation. The connection between ruler and subject became even more tenuous, even more attenuated, the possibility of action at a distance even more remote. Roman space became seasonally fragmented, with activities of all kinds postponed until the spring. And emperors always lived with an information deficit we can hardly credit today. There's a story that when Claudius was brought news that Messalina was celebrating her marriage with her latest lover, he cried, "Am I still emperor?" At that moment, he was only on the other side of the same city. Imagine trying to work out what's going on at Hadrian's Wall when you're camping out in Antioch. Miller repeatedly insisted in The Emperor, as elsewhere, on the materiality of communication. Transfers of cash, he would say, from provinces to armies had to make painstaking progress around the Roman road system. Embassies sometimes seemed to wander hopelessly around the provinces, trying to work out where the emperor was at any moment. Even imperial letters took weeks to reach officials and so on. Much of the empire moved at donkey pace. The fundamental fact of geographical alienation records a famous study. Oh, I wanted to show you a second Orbis map. Here we are. So this fundamental fact records a famous study of Australian history, Geoffrey Blainey's Tyranny of Distance, published in 1966. That classic work argued how, even in modern times, Australia's physical remoteness, especially from North America and Europe, and the vast distances within Australia frustrated repeatedly attempts to integrate into wider economic and political systems, and promoted, in fact, lots of ad hoc improvisation on the ground. People arrived there unable to carry out projects of which they'd been designed, but unable also to get quick directions on what to do instead. Blainey's book is one of the inspirations for Ralph Lang's excellent new book, Leading Rome from a Distance, which explores some of the impact of distance on the creation of the Principate. Distance allowed some late Republican generals to act with much more autonomy than their predecessors, but the cost was they lost control at the centre. Like their imperial successors, they were forced to place enormous trust in agents, either in the capital or in the conquered territory, or in both. Now, it used to be common to point to the inadequacy of the institution of a city-state for running an empire. And this truism was incorporated into explanations for the neglect of the Republican provinces, even the collapse of the Republic itself. There's sometimes been an implication that had the senatorial elite just been a little more imaginative, they might have institutionalised themselves out of the necessity of the Roman Principate. But no manner of political innovation could have mitigated the rapid disappearance of Rome's front line beyond the horizon. Miller believed there must have been a constant flow of letters between emperors and their agents. He called it government by correspondence. Regular embassies by the cities to the court, there may be 2,000 cities in the Roman Empire, and emperors regularly on the move. There's actually much less evidence for all this than you might think. I checked out Mary Beard's latest book on the emperor in the Roman world, and her attempts to do it still relies on looking at the number of letters that Pliny wrote in 1 year, allegedly, calculating this up by the number of governors, imagining everybody is equal, and you get to 12 letters a day. Now, that's possible, but there's several huge leaps of faith in that calculation. If you look at these journey times, we see how little this communication could have mitigated geographical distance. A letter sent from the governor of Bithynia, Pontus. And I have here a highly reliable image of Pliny the Younger on the left. This is from the cathedral in Como, where both Plinies appear in the guise of early church of erudits of the Renaissance, late medieval erudits. Now, a letter from the governor of Bithynia Pontus, if he happened to be in Nicomedia at the time, to an emperor, if he happened to be in Rome, according to Orbis, could not have had a response within 40 days, even if the message was answered the minute it arrived. As many of us have argued, including Carlos Norenia, the dialogic structure of Pliny's 10th book is therefore an artful fiction. The only matters on which it was sensible to consult the emperor were ones you were trying to kick into the long grass. Anything urgent, you had to act on the basis of what you hoped he thought you should have done in the circumstances. As for complicated issues, requests for further clarification would simply double the duration of the decision-making progress. Information must often have been lacking in the centre. Andrew Rigsby showed brilliantly in his Mosaics of Knowledge that if emperors were very good at collecting information and at storing it, they were terrible at retrieving it and processing it. So you imagine an empire of filing clerks who don't bother to keep an index. This is, I think, called discoverability these days. Numerous anecdotes, including some from Pliny's letters, suggest it wasn't easy for emperors to discover even what their predecessors had decided. Many provincial communities and individuals carefully archived official messages, presumably knowing the authorities could not be relied on to do the same. And they were right. The composition of the Codex Theodosianus begins with letters out to provincial governors saying, did any of our previous emperors happen to write to you? And if so, do you have a copy? And could you please send it to us so we can produce an authoritative account? What are the implications of all of this? Well, most obviously, emperors are compelled to place enormous trust in their representatives. All the key decisions are made on the ground and in the moment. They're also, of course, mostly made by amateurs, that's to say dignified male members of the property classes who spent maybe 5 or 6 years of their careers out in the provinces. They rarely spoke or understood local languages. They had no experience in the job. In the absence of a colonial service, some advice could be sought from enslaved attendants or in militarised provinces from experienced junior officers like the centurions. Otherwise, local elite members, all of them naturally interested parties, were the only guide to the complexities of provinces, some of which were hundreds of miles in extent and contained hundreds of cities. Numerous studies of provincial government have recognised the key role played by local elites in the working of the empire. This wasn't a matter of style, a choice to reduce the transaction costs of empire by taking the local property class into partnership. It's a necessity born of imperial ignorance and impotence. Emperors could, of course, visit. But these visits could never be spontaneous, and they were logistically incredibly complex. If an emperor based himself at Athens, at Belgrade or York for a few months, he had to trust other people to run things at the centre. Modern historians of empire, or let's say historians of modern empires, write of peripheral imperialism, the idea that many key decisions have to be made at the edge because the metrical can't be involved. Roman governors made these decisions very cautiously because the subsequent approval of a Roman emperor could not be taken for granted. If Australia laboured under the tyranny of distance, Roman subjects had to fear a distant tyrant, hence my title. I move to the third part of the lecture. So far, I imagine everything I've said has been absolutely unproblematic. I want to move on to a different argument now. One way of understanding the emergence of this new picture of Roman rule could be as an instance of the spatial turn. That refers to a fairly diffuse shift of focus across the humanities to explore the spatial dimensions of historical and social phenomena and institutions, either formally, or as in this case, simply by taking more account of the realities of space. 19th century architects of history, like Theodore Mommsen, on the left here, had described the Roman... Is he the only Roman historian to have won the Nobel Prize? I think he might be so far. The question of the legal basis. Now, Mommsen had described the Roman Empire almost entirely in terms of nascent political science, and particularly of law. The question of the legal basis for the power of the Roman emperors continues to be important in many debates, particularly outside the Anglosphere. On your handout, you have a 2015 conference volume, Il Princeps Romano, which is largely about whether or not the Roman emperors were magistrates or legal or tyrannical. Now, Miller set all those legal niceties aside, and he asked primarily about the realities and practicalities of the government, in a phrase about power in space. It might seem strange to locate the composition of emperor in this intellectual current. Miller's often been regarded as uninterested in historical theory, or let alone other disciplines. His work was criticised on those grounds. But that's not entirely fair. For 5 years, I was lucky enough to work in the same Oxford College as Fergus Miller. Often visited his office where the bookshelves absolutely crammed with Foucault and Hayden White and so on. As a matter of style, he chose not to refer to these sources of inspiration, but he's certainly very well involved in this and read widely in the history of other periods and places. Sparse references to all this is simply, in other words, a matter of taste. The emperor doesn't actually mention many of his colleagues either. The footnotes are almost entirely references to original sources. But it's another turn, not the spatial turn, that's influenced the response to Miller, and this is the cultural turn. Since Miller, no one has really tried to reinstate the previous picture. No one's tried to imagine the Roman Empire was micromanaged, was a machine that responded to the mildest touch of the wheel. No one thinks anymore that it could pivot on to adopt new policies as soon as a new person became emperor. Rather, as we sadly know, a modern state might be transformed immediately by the accession of a new chief executive. The Roman Empire remains, in scholarship anyway, resolutely pre-modern, that is to say, mired in the mud, donkey-bound, and like a landscape shrouded in mist, mostly visible only from close quarters. So if the Roman Empire didn't work as a modern state of vast size, how did it function? Answers have been sought in culture identity, in ideology and representation, in images and ceremonial. In short, to adopt the phrase of one of Miller's graduate students, the much missed Simon Price, in rituals and power. And you see here Simon's amazing book on the completely transformed our understanding of ruler worship. And next to it, a book he did in collaboration with modern historian David Cannadine, tracing similar themes through a whole range of other societies. Now, the attention given to imperial images, to coin issues, to the imperial cult in its widest sense, picks up Miller's preoccupation with communication. And here are a few other examples. If the emperor could not physically be everywhere, at least his image could be. In the absence of other mass media, coins might convey crude messaging about who was on the throne, that clearly didn't get to the Egyptians very quickly, about imperial victories, imperial building projects, and so on. Now, there have been several variations on this theme. Some focused on one part of the empire, others on the whole. Price represented imperial cult as one part of a complex exchange relationship between subject and ruler, essentially the same kind of exchange relationship of gift exchange that Greeks sought to cultivate between themselves and any other deity. Clifford Ando argued the Roman government's communicative actions, including the circulation of images, evoked a loyal consensus not just among elites but among subject populations. Carlos examined a set of ideals and virtues celebrated on imperial coinage and found them echoed in provincial symbolic production. Now, these approaches all differ slightly in the emphasis they play on provincial elites and on the content of the consensus that they think was engineered. They also look at different material, different parts of the empire, but they have a lot in common. They include an interest in how harmonious relations were established and the relatively small part that they give to coercion and threat of violence. Now, many of these authors have more recently reincorporated violence into their accounts, but in these initial responses, the empire remains a relatively passive, Iranic place. Implicitly, too, none of them seem convinced that the embassies and letters and the occasional emperor on the move was enough. All of them try to provide an answer, or part of an answer, to the question, how did the Roman Empire function? Now, functionalist analysis is by definition an investigation of how complex systems work. It can be thought of as an account in which the value of any given variable is set by the values of all the other variables in that system. Its strength is in explicating relationships between the parts. For us, maybe the parts might be emperor, army, court, various aristocracies, cities, taxpayers, add as many as you like. What functionalist analysis is not good at, though, is explaining dysfunction, at identifying internal contradictions, regular sources of stress, patterns of degradation and ultimate breakdown. And the ways of describing this and other kinds of analysis, my language is partly Marxist, but there's plenty of ways to look at this. Functionalist analysis, in other words, tells you how something works. It doesn't tell you why it doesn't. Now, we Roman historians, and I count myself in this group, who specialise in the history of the early Roman Empire, have focused much more on the question of how did it hold together than our colleagues who work on the Mid and Late Republic or on late antiquity. They are, many of them, very alert to signs of breakdown and collapse. For some, the Roman Republic starts to decline almost from the first Brutus. The late antiquity famously declines, for some people, for about 1,000 years. The explanation, I think, is the rather embarrassing one, that those of us who work on the early empire remain under the spell of Gibbon's assessment of the golden age of the Antonines. That here you have a peaceful interlude between two narratives of decline. And here you have a version. It goes on much longer, and it's quite interesting to read the whole thing, but I spared you either the brutality of a tiny font size or many screens of Gibbon. So here we have, in the 2nd century of the Christian era, the Empire of Rome comprehended the fairest part of the earth and the most civilized portion of mankind. If there's an undergraduate in the room, please do not put this in an essay. The frontiers of that extensive monarchy were guarded by ancient renown and disciplined valour. The gentle but powerful influence of laws and manners had gradually cemented the union of the provinces. Their peaceful inhabitants enjoyed and abused the advantages of wealth and luxury. Gibbon's appraisal depends on a mixture of ancient image-making and on gaps, lacunae, in the testimony. This golden period notably falls in the gap between the end of the detailed narratives of imperial tyranny provided by Tacitus and Suetonius and the beginning of Dio's equally detailed account of the failures of Commodus and the Severi. And since Gibbon, we have tried to fill that gap mainly from epigraphy. But inscriptions present a rosy image of the status quo, a theme I should go on to in a moment. Only the rarest anecdote, like that of Hadrian casually poking out the eye of a slave, reminds us that the 2nd century CE was not entirely a dream. I suggest that we should not take on trust the good functioning of the early Roman Empire. If this argument is accepted, even provisionally, we need not focus our effort on trying to assess the success of the imperial system. How did it function in the face of recalcitrant geography and feeble technology? There are a range of explanations of success currently on offer. The linked effects of law and enfranchisement in creating consensus, if you're interested in that line of argument. Explanations that lean on relative frequency of sunspots, climatic change, absence of epidemics, if you belong to that particular camp. Either way, these new explanations provide underpinning for the same old story. But what happens if we look instead for signs of weakness and failure? And that's what I intend to do from now on. Now, weakness and failure have not been entirely ignored by recent work. We have the classic work of James C. Scott, Seeing Like a State, which is actually a demonstration that very large-scale recent projects by states more often end in disaster than success. But there's also a growing archaeological literature on risk and failure, and quite a lot's been written actually just in the last 2 or 3 years on this. I put out here a discussion paper from Antiquity by Price and Yaffe. There's also important work by Astrid van Ooyen on how failure works. And this draws on a wider vocabulary of failure and discussion of failing forward and failing upward and all these sorts of themes. Can we find any failures in the Roman Empire? Inscriptions, I said, offer a rosy picture of Roman rule. Most, of course, are private. Grave markers are dedicated to the gods. But many of the longer ones recognise benefactions from rich members of their community, or the results of intercity diplomacy. Intercity diplomacy, which recalls the adage attributed to Kissinger about academic politics, that they're so vicious because the stakes are so low. Those inscriptions that deal with the relations between emperors and their subjects come overwhelmingly from the larger cities in a group of eastern provinces where hard stone and Greek political culture coincided. There are fewer than 50 civic decrees known from the Roman West in Latin, and of those almost every one is from Italy. Inscriptions of this kind, which record successful embassies, petitions that won a favourable response, or sacred letters sent by emperors, generally advertise what the local elite regard as satisfactory outcomes, and this is why they're inscribed. We have no way of knowing how many embassies were successful. What proportion of ambassadors came back with their tails between their legs? Disappointed parties didn't monumentalise their failures. Cities didn't praise those who had failed to get the emperor's benevolence directed in their attention. But there are a few instances where we can spot the failure of one party, largely because it's communicated by its more successful rival. I have here an example from Cyrene, and the link up there directs you to the inscriptions of Cyrenaica site, from which now text translation material is now available online for all who wish. So here we have a stele that includes a dossier of imperial letters, so received, of course, on papyrus, but then inscribed because the city, the Cyrenaicans, wanted to celebrate it. And you can see, I think, near the beginning, where we've got an extract from a letter of Antoninus, and he says, the citizens of Berenice have requested that an assize should be held in their city, that they wanted to be one of those cities that the governor of the province, Cyrene and Crete, had to visit every single year. But it seems to me difficult to add to the number of court days. As you know, the proconsul is already in charge of Crete at the same time as Cyrene. It's difficult to spend more time with it than he already does. Since the Berenicians request the assize should be held in each city in turn, presumably alternating this means, I replied it's not clear how the cities which already have an assize centre would like it if they have it removed from them. So, no. What we're seeing here is the Cyrenaicans commemorating the fact that the Berenicians sent their embassy and got a dusty answer. How they got hold of the letter, I'm not sure. And then you have more materials on, and you see the letter from Hadrian, as these things go in long cycles of people have a new go every time there's a new emperor. I'm surprised after sending an earlier protest, but joining the sacrifice of the games held by the Cyrenaeans, you have now for the first time dispatched an ambassador, for you are not ignorant that this kind of innovation is a source of strife between cities. There are other examples of this. There is, for example, a passage of Tacitus that records a dispute between the Lacedaemonians and the Messenians over a border sanctuary, which goes on for centuries. And there's also, sure it's not entirely epigraphic, we have an extract from Ulpian's account of the office of the proconsuls, which was preserved in the digest. And here, proconsul means governor. Ulpian is talking about what governors have to do. And he says it's proper when the governor entered the province to do so in that portion where it is customary. Whatever city he reaches first, he should pay attention to what the Greeks call epidemias and so on. There are some provinces to which he goes by sea, for example, Asia. To such an extent it is carried out that Emperor Antoninus stated in a rescript in reply to request the Asiatics, the consul is absolutely required to go by sea and he must land at Ephesus. The only possible context for this kind of dispute is someone saying, would it be okay if he came to Smyrna occasionally? Now, what this indicates, I think, and I have yet another one here. I'm going a bit crazy on disputes here. So here you have something from the British, which is in the British Museum. And this is Hadrian, Antoninus, Augustus, Pontifex Maximus, and he's writing to the Ephesians, and he says, in my letters to you I expressed my satisfaction that the people of Pergamon, another city, the rival city, had adopted the names I directed your city to use. I think, moreover, the people of Smyrna have by accident passed over these in their decree. And for future they'll show their right feeling by deliberate adoption of them. If you also in your letters shall also have made mention of their city in a manner that's becoming and has been decided. Now, our first reading of this is, the calm grade school teacher, assembling a bunch of scrappy citizens saying, play nicely together, guys. But there's maybe something more to it than that. Miller and others have focused on emperors handing out goodies to people. But so often these goodies are disputed. A competition is taking place, and the emperor has a real difficulty. The emperor's difficulty is, every time you make one person happy, you make others unhappy. So the act of petition and response generates ill feeling as well as gratitude. I remember talking much to a colleague who worked in the CNRS in France, and she had their research country, she had a very distinguished position. And I said, it must be great, all that power you have to give money to your friends. She says, no, everyone hates me. My friends think they got it because their grants application was so good, and everybody else thinks they didn't get it because I was biased against them. And this is the kind of position we should imagine for a Roman emperor, constantly trying to manage these economies of virtue. There's a parallel issue, of course, facing the gifts to individuals. If we focus only on successful patronage, as most studies of Roman patronage do, we get a sense of how the empire is held together, how it functions. Trust, reciprocal obligations, officia are generated through each act of patronage. Yet that same act disappointed others who felt equally or more entitled. Emperors surrounded themselves with friends, amici Caesaris, but befriending some aristocrats left others out in the cold. Anyone who's ever edited a journal will know about the experience of writing letters to people who don't get through peer review. We have no marble inscription saying, in a very strong field, it's impossible, in fact, to appoint you to command of the legions on the upper German limes. But in another year, we're sure you would have succeeded. Please do apply next year. This is one area, in other words, where we can see dysfunction built into the structure of the patrimonial empire. Where else might we find dysfunction? Military affairs is one obvious area. Imperial monuments and the titles Roman emperors took and placed on inscriptions on coinage focused on their triumphs. Even the suppression of revolt was itself often suppressed in literary texts, rather than admit that any people conquered by Rome might want to not be ruled by them any longer. The steady increase in the size of the legionary army over the 2nd and 3rd centuries, however, it suggests some level of discomfort with the security situation. Trajan is spectacularly successful in his wars against the Dacians and the Parthians, but that period of relative security that followed lasted only really for 2 reigns. From the 160s, emperors increasingly found on the frontiers, concentrating resources on the Danube and occasionally against the Persians as well, mainly in response to aggression from outside. The emperor seems to be on the back foot at this point. The rationale for moving the court to the periphery is clear. Emperors couldn't campaign at a distance because of the information problems. But entrusting major campaigns to other generals was undesirable. Tacitus, writing in the early 2nd century, offers many instances of where the success of a senatorial general, think Corbulo, Agricola, creates anxieties in the court. If we measure the golden age of the Antonines in terms of security, it lasts for barely half a century. Now, I could go on at great length on other dysfunctional aspects of the early imperial system. Taxation was slow. Worse, it was cumbersome. Given there was nothing like income tax, it was impossible to raise a few points to generate more income in a rush. Emperors never tried to manage public religion in the way that Republican senators tried to. Sporadic attempts to persecute Christians were definite failures. I do remember that John Matthews had a student who was measuring the effectiveness of Roman government by 3 criteria, and one of them was how good they were at persecuting, and the other was how good they were at building. They're quite good at building. As Eric Rebiarder said about Christians, though, the social cost of being a Christ worshipper in the early empire was relatively low. And perhaps a final indication of dysfunction is the frenetic activity of some emperors. Hadrian once again suggests himself, and he's a good point to argue from because he's right in the middle of what is presented to us as the most well-functioning period of the early empire. Miller, in fact, begins the first chapter of Emperor with a story told by Cassius Dio of Hadrian, approached by an old woman when he was travelling, who told the woman he didn't have time to listen to her, to which she responded, "Then don't be a Caesar." Now, Dio, interestingly, tells this as an indication of Hadrian's good humour, because he goes on to say, and Hadrian stopped and listened. For Miller, it's a paradigmatic instance of the primacy of petition and response. And he points out the version of this story being told about many other monarchs, including some pre-Roman ones. Hadrian, characteristically, is constantly on the move, rushing from one location to another, firefighting. He's a futile attempt to know the entire empire and be everywhere at once. How can he do this and also answer every subject's appeal? The answer is he cannot. Dio is also generally favourable in his assessment of Hadrian, but his account also produces indications of failure. You've got here Dio on the left and the Augustan history on the right for backhanded compliments. So, Dio, in a certain letter that Hadrian wrote, in which from many high-minded sentiments, he swore he would never do anything contrary to the public interest, nor put to death any senator, and he invoked his destruction upon himself if he should violate these promises in any wise. So far, so good. Hadrian, though he ruled with the greatest mildness, was nevertheless severely criticised for slaying some of the best men in the state at the beginning of his reign and again near the end of his life. And for this reason, he very nearly didn't get deified. Dio's Hadrian means well, but it doesn't always work out well. Again, the Augustan history. Hadrian was fond of literary study in both Greek and Latin. He's left behind a variety of prose writings as well as compositions in verse. For his ambition was insatiable, and hence he practised all conceivable pursuits, even the most trivial. For example, he modelled and he painted and he declared there was nothing pertaining to war or peace, to imperial or private life of which he was not cognizant. All this, of course, did people no harm. But his jealousy of all who excelled in any respect was most terrible and caused the downfall of many, besides utterly destroying several. And the Augustan history goes on. Yet at the same time, Hadrian abandoned many provinces won by Trajan and also destroyed, contrary to the entreaties of all, the theatre Trajan had built in the Campus Martius. These measures, unpopular enough in themselves, are still more displeasing to the public because of his pretence that all the acts he thought would be offensive had been secretly mandated by Trajan. Unable to endure the power of Attianus and formerly his guardian, he was eager to murder him, but he hesitated, given the knowledge that he already laboured under the odium of murdering 4 other men of consular rank, although as a matter of fact, he always claimed it to be Attianus who'd incited their execution. Now, I'm not suggesting, of course, that we can actually reconstruct a picture, a consistent psychological picture of Hadrian, except as an act of novelisation. And I'm also very aware of the risk of pulling anecdotes out of longer texts in order to make a point, something for which Miller's book was justly criticised. But I do think in these anecdotes that must have circulated independently before being collated into these narratives, we can detect an ancient consciousness of the contradictions of the role of emperor, of the impotence of emperors. Ideal emperors could be imagined by philosophers who draw an early kingship theory all the way back to Xenophon and the Scyropaedia, or more creatively in the hand of Philodemus to Homer. Oratory can instruct nearly pure examples of the Tyrant and the Octus Princeps, the best of emperors, as Pliny does in the Panegyricus. So the notion you might have people absolutely tyrannical and absolutely perfect was clearly circulated, but in actuality, that's to say in historiographical account, no emperor ever actually manages to make it. Dysfunction is at the heart of the Principate. Let me pull things together and conclude. I'm not the first to suggest that we should emphasise weakness at the centre. There's an influential model of it produced by Patricia Crone, historian of early Islam and also a comparativist, in this book that you see on the left-hand side of your screen. She describes what she sees as a widespread phenomenon of a capstone monarchy. A capstone monarchy for Crone was a metaphor drawn from the structure of a stone arch. At the very top of the arch, a single stone was balanced, which exercised no big force downwards, but held in place all the others. Remove the capstone, the arch collapses. This was her idea about how early monarchy might have operated, despite its likely weakness. A capstone to hold in place all the other parts. And again, if you like, you can think Senate and people, Romans, provincials, the army, civilians, all held in place by the weak autocrat. Now, this isn't the way that ancient testimony presents emperors, but that's not a reason to dismiss it. It might be simply distance of perspective. Maybe from close-up emperors did seem terrifying, their arbitrary power limited by neither law nor custom. Maybe from a distance they really do seem to be invisible but necessary. But this doesn't work. Capstone monarchy as applied to Rome is unsatisfactory for a completely other reason. And that's that it is yet another functionalist argument about how the Roman Empire actually worked. I think it's the tapping. If we try, and I know it's difficult, not to be deliberately selective in our choice of testimony, what we actually hear is a cacophony of discordant voices. Serene imperial portraiture jostles with the recitation of arbitrary executions. Shiny marble declarations of imperial benefactions conceal smugness over the failure of rivals to get better responses to their petitions. Those coins that show Severus and his two coins ruling together in harmony are undone by narratives of how after Severus' death one son killed his brother. And then there is the silence of provinces, which do not advertise their imperial favour. Was there resentment in western northern cities? Is this a gap in the evidence? John Weisweiler has pretty clearly shown recently that only a few provinces ever ended up sending their most important members to the Senate. There were massive inequalities in how provinces were treated. Severus' last advice to his sons was supposed to stick together and look after the army. What about all the other forces that a good capstone should be holding in play? Now, we've been spending, I think, about half a century looking for the symbolic unity of the Roman Empire and trying to work out how it can have functioned, given the vast obstacles in the way that Fergus Miller rightly insisted on. But I suggest we haven't found a good explanation. No institutions, diplomatic, governmental, fiscal, military, education filled the gap. Ideologies existed, but they look very local, like every manifestation of ruler cult is in fact very local. I suggest we stop looking, and instead we accept that the discourse of empire was perhaps always fragmented. Rather than a conversation conducted with loud hailers from one end to the other, I suggest that people are talking past each other and mostly inaudibly to each other. Roland Barthes famously wrote something similar about the lover's discourse, that it's not a conversation shared between two people, but is always fragmented. It could only be analysed as a discursive sight, the sight of one person speaking within himself amorously, confronting another who did not speak. Fragments of an Imperial Discourse might have been a better title for this lecture, but you never quite know what's going to be in the last paragraph when you suggest the title, do you? I've tried to move us away from mapping communication towards listening to a jumble of performative speech acts. Emperors project their values. Who hears, who cares? They let civic elite members express their desires and claim the benefit for all the good things that have come their way. The poor express their hunger for food and justice, the army their inarticulate concern with order and hierarchy and loyalty. But this isn't necessarily a conversation. Many parties had interest in claiming that the empire functioned. Emperors obviously did. Their enslaved and former enslaved agents claimed that they did. Those civic elites who found themselves temporarily on the top in local hierarchies clearly wanted people to believe the empire worked. And these are the people who've generated most of our source material. Others voice frustration and disappointments. The picture I've given you is much less orderly than petition and response. But I think we probably wouldn't have got here without the influence of Miller's Emperor. And I leave you with a picture of the Roman Empire as I imagine it, donkey-bound and in the mist. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Greg. Thank you so much. It occurs to me that you have, by focusing on weakness, failure, absence, you cursed your own PowerPoint. To be on and off and intermittent.
And I should own that, because nowadays we have to fail upwards.
Yes, right, yeah, exactly. It seems like a remarkable figure for what you were getting at. Unlike most, say, the lectures, there is a question and answer period. So the floor is open if you could just wait for the microphone to ask a question.
Thanks, Greg, for this really great talk. I had a quick question. So you talked mostly about kind of internal problems of communication within the empire. Do you think there was, or what do you think the comparison between the systems of communication within the empire versus trying to communicate with people outside of the empire? And I think most immediately, given things like the tyranny of space or the tyranny of distance, as you mentioned, the temptation would be to say that it was even worse when you were talking about communication outside of the empire. But I'm also wondering if more often than not, Roman armies are stationed at the boundaries of the empire, or if the emperor's interests more often than not prioritize the kind of communication you're trying to keep with non-Romans. Does that mean that actually communication outside of the internal affairs of the empire were better, or are they kind of similar, or how would that compare?
Well, thank you very much, Jonathan. That's a great question. Two answers come to mind off the top of my head, and one is that there must have been lots of information flowing in and out of the empire across the frontiers, which never ended up being transmitted to us. And we think about on the northern frontier, there's often a 200-kilometre zone within which lots of Roman goods are found. And we know lots of people from outside the empire came and served in the army and then went back there, sometimes even building Roman-style villas. So I imagine that, as Doug Lees argued for late antiquity, frontiers are areas of quite rapid information exchange, but that it simply doesn't end up in the kind of text we have. So that's the close foreigners, if you like, the externi genti who aren't that externi. But I mean, the other thought I have is that we know that some objects move enormous distances, and yet information hardly with them. And I think looking at, say, what the Romans knew of China or the Chinese of Rome, is almost nothing, and what they know is wrong. But goods move backwards and forward up and down the Silk Road and on the Indian Ocean system, and we have these material evidence of extraordinary exchanges. And a totemic one would be the Berenice Buddha, which seems to be a pretty iconographically standard image of the Buddha, found in a Roman Red Sea port, but carved out of Proconnesian marble from Northwest Asia Minor, using techniques used by sculptors from that area. So somewhere in this movement of skills and people and images, there are information flows, but they haven't somehow transmitted up to us. So the old adage of prehistorians is that goods move further than information. And I think that probably is true in this case. But I do agree with you that there must be a very sharp information drop-off. And perhaps some areas like the frontiers, like the northern frontier, it's not quite so sharp. And other areas like the Red Sea, and you'll know better than I how this works further down the Nile and Sudan and so on, there might be rather more rapid gradient. Is that an answer? Yeah. Oh, thank you for the question.
Thank you so much. This is really interesting. And I'm curious about this distance idea and the example of Claudius. He doesn't know what's going on the other side of the city. Is there a distance you think that it would work? Would the system function? Was it built in a way at all to function with the kind of set of, the provinces and things like that, if the scale was different? Or is it just doomed no matter what?
Well, you know I want to say Doom, don't you?
Yeah.
I mean, I think it does. You're absolutely right. It must change at scale. And thinking about, say, the mid-Republican system as we imagine it, or perhaps even the early Republican system, where magistrates, when they become generals, acquire a whole new set of legal freedoms and are then exempt from a lot of legal restrictions. But they're only gone for a few weeks, a couple of months at most. So and this is not very unlike perhaps what happens in Imperial Athens with people subject to interrogation and public testing at the end of their period of office, which would be a fascinating innovation in our contemporary political systems, wouldn't it? But I think any distance at all, you need to make some adjustment. But I think it just gets so much more difficult when you have these enormous distances that you... And I don't think it's unique to Rome. I think every empire I've looked at, the Western satraps are significantly more independent of the Achaemenid rulers than those who are a bit closer, same of Armenia. And certainly in the Middle Ages, you have these sort of much smaller territorial kingdoms, which have at their fringes people who are marcher lords, the Italian marchians, places where your subordinates have to be less subordinate. And also, of course, places from which rebellion, real or imagined, might come back into the centre. So yeah, I think it's always a problem, but I think it scales up to different kinds of problem.
Hi, I'm suddenly thinking about Ottoman Empire fratricide and the practice in which the Sultan would, put his favored son for the succession closer to Istanbul, or do you think there could be something similar going on in Rome, in which the people who would be closest to the emperor and exchanging information have more power, and how does that interact with also giving trusted individuals power over places further away?
That's really interesting. I know so little about the Ottomans that, some things seem to replicate, like using Christian janissaries because you don't want to trust co-religionists and some. But what I really would like to conjure up would be my former UCLA colleague, Chun-Hee Ko, who's written an amazing book called The Sublime Post about communications within the Ottoman Empire. And I think would be able to answer that much better than I can. So, but thank you. I think it's definitely a lead to follow. Yeah.
Can I ask a question for myself? I'm thinking about this anecdote you took from Dio, where Hadrian swears an oath, and typical, he swears an oath whether if he doesn't match it, the god will destroy him. But then Dio goes on to say, well, he didn't live up to his oath, so he broke his oath, and he almost didn't get deified for it. This is very interesting. Coordination of a failing regular deity who doesn't punish the oathbreaker almost leads to Hadrian himself not being a god. So I suppose my question is a little bit about political theology. In some ways, what was so interesting about Simon Price's version of the empire story was that the centrality of imperial cult was partly an expression of the power differential. But if the emperor is in fact so weak and the whole thing is so misty, I wonder whether in some ways, one of the ways in which the emperor is like a god is that actually they're arbitrary. Sometimes it doesn't work out, which seems to be also totally acceptable in the kind of polytheistic system, is that your deity sometimes doesn't appear when you expect. And I wonder whether you're sort of open to that understanding of the theology of that.
That's really interesting, isn't it? And there's a bit right at the beginning of the Annals where he talks about how all preces turned to Tiberius. Mm-hmm. So all the prayers that had once gone to one deity moved to another. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Thank you, yeah. I'd like to think more about that.
It is the arbitrary god.
Yes.
Rather than the super powerful one. Right?
Yeah. Must be a different one to balance, wasn't it? Because to some extent, routines of ritual depend on predictability, don't they? Mm-hmm. But then I guess you have to have a way to explain when it doesn't work. So maybe arbitrary gods are a useful compensating idea. So like these, you know that story in Bourdieu about, I can't remember which people, maybe the Kabyle, who say that Christians are, leopards are Christians and they always fast on Fridays. People remember this vaguely from the outline of a theory of practice? And he says, well, yes, they will insist that leopards are Christians, but this doesn't mean that they don't lock their sheep up on a Friday. And so there's a kind of disjuncture between different ideas. Yeah.
Any further questions? Excuse me, sir.
Thank you for a fascinating talk. I was just curious, the metaphor that you sort of threw us as a kind of plumb line, perhaps, the capstone being like a stone arc of a monarchy.
Yes.
And I was just, I don't know, it was just very beguiling, and it made me ask a lot of questions about what stuff is in that capstone in terms of holding the empire together. Yeah. And I guess, in a contemporary context, like, is there a way to take out the capstone? So what is in that capstone? Thank you.
Oh, thanks. I really admire Patricia Crone's work. She was she rewrote the book about the origins of Islam, and she wrote this amazing thing. And she's also a fantastically encouraging person. She would go to conferences and leave with the addresses of half a dozen graduate students she'd send other stuff to. And I think this was her answer, looking at much more systematic than I have, at a whole range of pre-modern, pre-industrial civilizations. And she noticed what perhaps Romanists are not good at noticing was certain regularities, and this regularity that the kings, the emperors, whatever you want to call them, don't seem to be as powerful as everybody claimed and said, they themselves and others too. So this was her answer. So it's also, I guess, a structuralist argument, isn't it? That that this person is almost. And I remember, I believed this for years. I remember sort of teaching the Roman Civil War in one of my first jobs, and we had real blackboards and real chalk there. Which actually you can still get in UCLA, but in most places it's gone. And I would just drew a map with all the armies and emperors and so on, and put the emperor in there, rub out the emperor, and say, this is what happens when Nero's dead. And they all have to put somebody else in the position that the empire has become a system that demands an individual in the middle. Doesn't matter who they are or what they do. So it's a kind of holding it together. So what's in? As for removing it, no. If that's right, then removing the capstone doesn't help at all. Either the whole house of cards falls in, or in less metaphorical terms, somebody else steps up.
So the very idea of the emperor is the capstone.
Yes. Sorry. Thank you.
They're sort of addicted to inequality. They must have some inequality to rest the political order on.
Yeah.
There must be someone. There must be some way that they're different from their neighboring city. They're just addicted to inequality.
It's right, isn't it, that after the revolution, the founding fathers discussed whether the right course would be for the new United States to have a king. Should we have a king? Now we've got rid of one. How are we going to manage without? And instead they designed this sort of relatively innocuous office of president.
There's a book by Eric Nelson on that. Any further questions?
Thank you. I really enjoyed it. I really liked how you were conceptualizing failure in a sort of Roman center, but as someone who also is thinking about failure and working on failure, a thing that I kind of grapple with, and I was hoping that you could help me with, honestly, is how do you do a history where failure plays such a major role without it making like historical changes an accident?
Yeah, nice question. I mean, I've read more by archaeologists on failure than by historians, and as far as I can gather, they've sort of got to the point of saying, well, there's lots of different scales of failure, and that a lot depends on where you frame the narrative. That if you frame it at one point, the failure is the end of the story, but if you frame it otherwise, there might be a story of resilience or recovery or replacement. And so failure is a moment in a narrative rather than actual fact. I mean, I think for me, on this one, I think I suspect that one of the difficulties is that we have set the bar for failure so high that the Republic has to collapse or the Roman Empire has to be abolished, otherwise it works fine.
Yeah.
And equally, we need to think about coexistence of faith. So, I mean, I used to occasionally try and set a question to my students, what were Augustus's greatest failures? And they always found this absolutely impossible, because all the books told them how Augustus had been fantastically successful. Formed the army, sorted out the tax system, rebuilt the city of Rome, got all the poets to write absolutely on message. And obviously that's a very, very implausible account. So survival isn't enough to be a success. And if we say just to carry on existing, that doesn't make something functional. But equally, it doesn't have to completely disappear to be a failure.
Yeah.
So it's trying to find blends and levels of failure. This sounds incredibly wishy-washy, doesn't it?
No,
But,
it's great.
But I will struggle to do better.
No.
Well, thank you again, Greg, for a wonderful return, say the lecture.
Thank you very much for inviting me back.